Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and happy hump day. It is Wednesday, November 8th, 2023. I do apologize. We're going to skip the formalities today because I have a lot of interesting and yet concerning news to pass along for my folks down there in the Caribbean, as well as especially Central America. But before we do get started, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already, and make sure your notifications are turned on. There's going to be a lot of new content and continuous weather updates as we go through the rest of this El Nino winter time, moving forward throughout the rest of 2023, as well as potential tropical updates with what we have taken shape down there in the Southern Caribbean AOR. Jumping right into it, guys, we're looking at our infrared satellite imagery, and you could see a very, very dense area of convergent wind flow along a frontal boundary that's working its way through the Caribbean out into the central Atlantic, bringing in some very, very good conditions, albeit warm conditions for the east and southeastern United States. You can see just off the corner of the satellite image here, we have a ridge beginning to build in across much of eastern Conus at this time, responsible for the warming trend we've had across the board. However, it is also helping to ignite some pretty good thunderstorm activity for parts of Puerto Rico, the British U.S. Virgin Islands, and the northern Leeward Islands as well, seeing a little bit of that precip action moving off to the east, affecting your location as well. This is also being helped in part induced by a wave that's working its way through the pattern as well, moving closer to Jamaica, where we could see some thunderstorm activity ignite over that area as well. Once that wave comes into contact with land and starts to butt up against the higher terrain features in Jamaica, we could see that mechanical lift help to induce additional thunderstorm activity. That is not the main reason we're talking today. I'm more concerned with what's initially going to be happening out over Central America, guys, and we're going to talk about that here in a moment. All across the rest of the board, though, we have our garden variety thunderstorm activity popping off in northern South America. The intertropical convergence zone out over our tropical Atlantic is still ablaze with activity, albeit nothing organized thanks to increased wind shear out there. And you could see across North America, or at least this portion of the United States indicated here on our satellite image, we're pretty quiet. But if you look down over the deep south and the Gulf Coast, we're starting to see some upper level cloud cover beginning to filter in, because our rain chances are indeed finally going to start to go up, especially for Texas and Louisiana, spreading east into Mississippi as we go over the next several days. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. All right, so first things first, we've let the 12Z Euro populate today, guys, and if you wanted to know whether or not El Nino is in full effect despite the dry spell we've been on down here in the southeast, it is definitely firing on all cylinders. As you take this through time, you can see just how much extensive rainfall we're expecting for Central America and parts of the Caribbean for that matter, especially as we get towards the back end of this run. Take a look at how much precip accumulation we're expecting for our folks already inundated by lots of rain since last week, after we had not only our invest area pass through there, but this is also a textbook El Nino setup. If you look very closely, you can see that parts of Mexico and the western periphery of Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, are predominantly dry, whereas the coastline of the Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, moving down into Honduras and Nicaragua, and even closer to Costa Rica and then Panama for that matter, we're seeing lots and lots of rainfall. And I did a little homework behind the scenes just to help determine exactly why we're going to see this consistent barrage of heavy rainfall, especially as we get into mid-November. And believe it or not, two things are occurring at this point. Number one, we are in the tail end of their wet season, so this is climatologically anticipated for that general region. Also, we typically see an uptick, a widespread and dramatic uptick in our precip accumulation thanks to El Nino. So as you can see, there is a clear delineation between where we are dry and we are most moist, and that is an indication that our El Nino feature out in the Pacific is creating all this havoc down there for Central America. You can also see this large bubble of very, very dense precip accumulation. That rainfall is expected to come down, and that's where we're looking at the possibility of a tropical cyclone. I'm not going to say disturbance, depression, tropical storm just yet. There's a lot of interesting phenomena going on down there, and we're going to talk about that here in a moment. I just wanted to highlight that we are looking at, once again, a dangerous setup in terms of seeing widespread flooding, to include another induction of mudslides and landslides that could really put a lot of people in harm's way down there, especially with the amount of rainfall we've already seen over the last several weeks down across Mexico, Central America, going down towards South America with our daytime thunderstorms constantly firing. And we can't rule out the threat for some good rainfall accumulation for our Windward Islands specifically. You could see a lot of the moisture funneling in out of the ITCZ, that eastern central Atlantic down here near the equator, moving through our Windward Islands. So Trinidad, Tobago, Barbados, the southern Windward Islands of the Lesser Antilles, you can definitely see anywhere between 1.5 inches to 2 inches of rain over the next week or two. You can see we have our 0Z probabilities. Unfortunately, 12Z is not all the way in, guys. I wish I could show you. We're right on the brink of having all of that data in, so we're going to stick to 0Z. I would imagine that we're going to see a very similar picture communicated at 12Z. So here we go. At 4 days out, you can already see our tropical depression favorabilities going up to about 25-30%. You go to about 5 days out, and now we're already reaching past the 30 percentile here. And then as you go into day 6, 7, and then down the road to 8, we are now well above 50%, approaching 65% probability we'll see development. And then at 240 hours out, we are finally, there's a very small yellow shading in there, approaching the 70 percentile. So this has definitely been increasing over the last several days. I haven't taken my eye off of it. And the reason I'm not entirely sold on an organized tropical system is because of what I see happening in the upper levels. We'll get to that here in a second. Here's a quick glance at our tropical storm formation probabilities. And if you go down towards the very back end of this loop, you can start to see some shading filling in with an upper amount of about 20 to 25%, even approaching 30% just to the south of Jamaica, that we could see some kind of a tropical storm-like entity form up. Again, we'll talk dynamics here in a second. I'm not going to go full-fledged tropical storm on this just yet. We'll talk you through what the environment is doing in the upper levels as to why this could go back and forth, or maybe not even become anything more than just a hellacious rainmaker. It goes without saying, even though the GFS is predicting a major hurricane down there, I have been looking at the ensembles, and the ensembles are now in agreement with the Euro probabilities as well as the Euro ensembles that something could come wandering out of the southern Caribbean, moving towards Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, pressing across Cuba, into the southern Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, and then out into the greater Atlantic Ocean. And then, of course, guys, we're going to go to our deterministic Euro model. This is 12 Zulu. As you go all the way towards the back end of the loop, we are doing some long-range forecasting out here. You can kind of see, because of these very strong prevailing easterlies, as well as the wind flow coming up out of the south, moving across Central America, that area of surface convergence has what looks to be a stationary low-pressure vortice forming down there in the deep southern Caribbean. That's number one why I'm kind of looking whether or not we're going to see an actual tropical cyclone or tropical energy come up out of there, because we already have a semi-permanent vortice embedded down there because of how strong of the easterly prevailing winds we have down there. As you go towards the very tail end of the run, you can see that this low finally starts to migrate, being picked up by what's happening at 500 and 300 millibars. All right, so if you look on the left-hand side, these are both Euro platforms here, Euro products, I should say. On the left, we are at 500 millibar geopotential heights, and on the right-hand side, we are at 300 millibars, the jet level. So we have one of two possible outcomes that are going on here. If you look first at that 500 millibar chart, you can see we are underneath a broad amplitude ridge, which would help to not only induce a lot of wind shear along its backside or its southern side, but it'll also provide us with a lot of good inundation with moisture and relative humidity content, which will help to not only keep our unstable area down there in the southern Caribbean and across Central America. If you could imagine that we have that clockwise flow around this ridge driving moisture straight towards the Central American landmass for an extended period of time, you're also going to have that very weak low vortice at the surface spinning down there, not really doing much with itself because it's entrained underneath this upper level ridge. Now, if you go further in time, watch how that ridge begins to vacate and we get a little bit of a weak trough axis down there. You can see it start changing the color down there with a little bit of light blue shading trying to pick that system up. And now if we move on over to the right-hand chart here at 300 millibars, we go back to the beginning, you can see our area of subtropical ridging still in place with a little bit of upper level wind shear. This isn't a wind shear chart, but you can tell just by the way the streamlines are oriented down here that even though we have diffluent flow and an increase in wind speeds down through here, it would look favorable if you were looking at just this chart alone. But let me tell you, we'll go over there in a second, there's still a lot of wind shear down across our Caribbean AOR, but as that trough comes in and we get an introduction of stronger jet energy, take a look at how those winds begin to wane out, and then we have a little bit of amplification or strengthening of our ridge, kind of getting rid of a lot of that shear activity until that trough can come on in and start to recreate a lot of the shear and very harmful conditions for a tropical cyclone to form. But I do believe it's this upper level influence that's trying to help it to migrate to the north, whether it be as a bona fide tropical system or simply a jet-induced low low because of the dynamics and the El Nino factor we've had kind of marinating across much of the Caribbean and Central America. Now we're going to look at the GFS as well on the right-hand side, and our euro is back on the left. If you look, again, we have all that wind shear down across there for quite a bit of time. Doesn't really do a whole lot because of that ridge in the upper levels, helping to keep it in place. But finally, as you get towards the mid and back end of the loop, and we get that introduction of that upcoming trough, a little bit of increased subtropical jet energy, what that allows it to do is amplify a little bit and increase its northernmost reach, which will take a lot of the jet energy that's sitting across the Caribbean Sea and move it to the north, which could maybe open up a small window of opportunity for a surface low pressure to form. But we very quickly see the reintroduction of wind shear a la that trough axis indicated on both of our charts here. So it's very difficult to determine if this is going to be an actual tropical energy feature coming out of the Caribbean, or a disturbance, guys, for lack of a better term, a disturbance down there in the Caribbean, or if this is actually something induced by the upper levels, because when you go over to vorticity, you can clearly see exactly what the 500 and 300 millibar pattern are doing to it. So here we go. This is our 12Z Euro vorticity chart. I'm going to quickly go through this loop. You can see we have leftover remnant vorticity down there across Central America, helping to induce those thunderstorms. Eventually, it tries to migrate back over open water, but if you look over the southeast, here comes our next trough. You can see that weak ridge and the contour gradient pattern, these black lines. At 500 millibars, this would be called a contour gradient as opposed to a sea level pressure gradient. So if you watch as this trough comes down, and you look at all this disorganized rotation, this vorticity down there across the southern Caribbean, as you go through time, look at how it gets picked up. And it becomes just a very, very disorganized and very broad upper-level vorticity couplet, or broad circulation center. So now we're left with two possible end results. Nonetheless, this is going to be a huge rainmaker down there. But now it's whether or not this is going to pick up vorticity from the trough and spin into a low-level cyclone, or if this is going to get pulled in by that trough and become an elongated, disturbed rainmaker for much of the Caribbean islands down there, like Jamaica, Haiti, parts of the Cayman Islands, Cuba, and then as it branches further to the north. You can see the same thing on our Canadian model. The Canadian model honestly has been very persistent and very well in line with what the Euro has been calling for I believe the last 3 days now. They've been mirror representations of one another, showing almost exactly the same data at all levels of the atmosphere. As you track this 500 millibar vorticity loop through the cycle, you can see we have a lot of leftover vorticity coming off of South America, lingering over parts of Costa Rica and Panama, coming in also off the East Pac monsoonal trough. And as that next feature comes in, you can see all this increased vorticity helping to bring the thunderstorm activity to parts of Texas, moving into Louisiana to help alleviate our drought conditions up there, finally give us some pretty good rainfall accumulation to hopefully help that out a little bit. As that transitions off to the east, take a look at how it begins to come down across Florida, down closer to the Bahama Islands, and then we have another area of upper level vorticity really beginning to dig in into the Gulf of Mexico and the northernmost portions of our Caribbean. Now, as you begin to see an organized low height center or vorticity couplet down there in the southern Caribbean, as these two interact, look at how the Canadian model has a lot of that vorticity immediately being pulled into that weak shortwave trough or that weak 500 millibar upper air trough over the Bahamas, and it becomes very, very stretched out like so. You don't really get a whole lot of that concentration we see with a bona fide tropical system, let alone something that's organizing, trying to take on our next named system. So very interesting setup here. Once again, you could kind of see that trough beginning to wash out, so now it remains a question being this far out into the future. We are at the very tail end of these model runs, so there's going to be some more adjustments. There's going to be a change in its depiction. Right now, what we do have for certain based on the synoptic layout of the environment, not only over the United States, but over parts of Mexico and the rest of the Caribbean for that matter, it is anticipated to track off like this up to the east and east-northeast. So it looks like our folks in Jamaica, maybe the Cayman Islands if it tries to wander to the north before swinging east, Cuba, especially Turks and Caicos, and the Bahamas are going to have to watch for this up-and-coming rainmaker for you guys that is expected to drop a lot of rainfall. We were seeing estimates, at least preliminary estimates, of between 4 to 6 inches. So outside of the flash flooding risk we are expecting once again for Central America, CENTAM, it looks like that flood risk and the dangerous conditions we saw repeated in Belize, Nicaragua, and Honduras is now going to expand out with whatever this cyclone decides to do as it moves off to the east and northeast. Taking a quick glance at the surface mean sea level pressure chart, you can already see just how much rainfall accumulation we're expecting with this. There's our very weak vortice down there, our low pressure center at 1,001 millibars. This ebbs really well with what the European model is expecting, somewhere in that same general ballpark in terms of depth or intensity with that system. But look at how that trough comes across and we get that interaction with our frontal feature over there as well. Look at how much not only convergent wind flow we have through here, but just how much precip we're expecting to take shape because of not only this low beginning to form, but the general interaction between multiple different air masses out there across the southeast and the Bahamas and the Caribbean Sea for that matter as well because of this giant high to the north. So still a lot of digging to do. We do have quite a ways away until this could possibly start to take shape. We're really watching for that imminent flood threat for our guys down there in Central America to start to show itself once more before this can get going. I believe once we see that threat for rainfall begin to increase for Central America, that's when whatever decides to try to show itself in the Southern Caribbean is most likely to make itself readily apparent to all of us tracking that general source region. But all right, guys, we are concluding this Weather Center segment. I hope you join me tonight at 8 p.m. for our Wednesday night Tropics Talks because we're definitely going to dig deep into all this information, especially once the rest of our probabilities and our ensembles can come in from the Euro and we can cross-compare them with the likes of the Canadian model, the GFS, of course, as well as whatever other analysis data we get in before 8 p.m. tonight Eastern Standard Time. If you haven't done so already, guys, I've had a lot of new viewers coming across the channel over the last month now since my Hurricane Tammy coverage, as well as what's been going on for the rest of the United States as well. Please make sure your notifications are turned on because we have a lot of new content preparing to roll out as we get further into fall and eventually enter the winter time of December and then going forward into next year. So please make sure your notifications are on and you have subscribed to the channel. It would be sincerely appreciated. We'll see you later tonight at 8 p.m., guys. Thank you so much for joining me on this Wednesday afternoon. I hope all is great for your neck of the woods, and we'll see you later. This is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.